Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to Cheap Shots, the series where we'll show you how to save money on your miniatures painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. Whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, you will learn how to achieve incredible results without the premium price tag. And on today's video, we're going to show you guys how to quickly and more importantly cheaply paint up Rippa's Snarl Fangs, a band of Snarl Fang riding goblins from the Warhammer Underworlds. By following the tips and techniques that we recommend, we actually will only cost you $31.67 to paint these guys to a beautiful tabletop standard. And when you compare that to Army Painter Army Painter as well as Citadel, their total of $190.70 will end up giving you a grand total savings of $159.03. So that being said, let's go and show you guys how to cheaply paint up the Snarl Fangs. So the first thing you have to do, of course, is to assemble as well as prime your miniatures. Now, when it comes to these miniatures, they are Warhammer Underworlds miniatures, so they're very easy to assemble. They're just kind of push fit assemblies, so very easy to assemble. Really can't mess it up, and you really don't have to worry about texturing the bases too much, because most of the time the bases are textured already with some really cool, interesting sculpts on it. So because of that, you just gotta assemble your miniatures thusly. As you can see, I have my 3 Snarl Fangs there. And the next thing I gotta do, of course, is to prime your miniatures. Now, for me, I like to use Rust-Oleum flat white primer. I can get this at my local Walmart. I just give it once over the entirety of the miniature to get a good solid base coat to work off of. Now, priming does a couple of things that are quite important for miniatures war painting. The first thing it actually does, it creates a surface for your acrylic paints to adhere to. And the reason why is because, unfortunately, if you were to paint your miniatures on bare plastic with the acrylic paints, the slightest bit of friction will actually rub the paint off of your miniature and absolutely ruin the finish of your miniature. So priming kind of solves this problem for you. At the same time, priming also has a large part to play in the vibrancy and the value of the color that you have on your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, the darker the primer, the more subdued the value of your colors are going to be. So because I'm going to be using an oil wash on these miniatures, it's going to really darken down the tone, I decided to go with the flat white primer so that way the colors are more vibrant and more colorful, so that way when I do the oil washing, it'll won't be as subdued so much. So now that we're done priming, the first thing we gotta do, of course, now is to do our base coats. We're gonna start off with the wolves that these characters are riding, or the Snarl Fangs, and we're actually using 3 different colors for this one. For the fighter with the sword, we're using khaki by Apple Barrel paint. For the one in the bow, we're using pewter gray by Apple Barrel, and for the one on the far right with the spear, we're using light mocha. Now, all these paints you can get at your local Walmart. I'm just gonna do 2 thin coats directly on the soft fur that's on the underbelly, as well as the neck, the maw, as well as the paws and legs of these creatures as well. And the reason why is because we're gonna use a darker color for the top coat on top of them to kind of create that kind of blended organic look for these miniatures. So just put 2 thin layers. You don't have to be particularly neat at this point. Just make sure you got good coverage on the parts that you want to be colored with this color for the fur. Now, the next color we're going to use are on the goblins themselves. For the riders, we're going to use Palm Leaf by Apple Barrel paint. You can get this at your local Walmart as well. It's a beautiful palm light green color. I love using it for all the orcs and goblin miniatures in our studios collection. I just put 2 thin layers on all the exposed flesh on these goblins. Now, there is quite a bit on these guys, so just go and just generously make sure you put down your 2 thin coats to get good even coverage all over the flesh. Now, if you do make a mistake with it getting on directly onto the top coat of the wolves, don't feel bad, because we'll work on that later on, and that's going to fix that problem. And now that we're done base coating the flesh of the goblins, next thing we do, of course, is a dry brush. For this, I like to use Lime Sherbet by Apple Barrel paint. It's a nice lime sherbet kind of pastel color, and I use this for the dry brushing directly on the palm leaf that we did earlier. Now, dry brushing is a nice technique to use to create the illusion of depth on your miniatures. It creates this illusion of depth by doing highlighting. What ends up happens when you do dry brushing on your miniature, the pigments of the paint adhere to the base surface of the miniature, while the darker color stays in the recesses. So things that we can see now are things like the musculature, as well as the bone structure of these goblins. Does a beautiful job of bringing out those highlights and creating that illusion of depth. Now, I will warn you guys, when you do dry brushing, you will have this kind of pastel, kind of chalky appearance of your miniatures. Don't stress out if you do see that, because when we get to the oil washing stage, it's going to smooth out those transitions. Now next we'll do, of course, are the top coats on these wolves as well. For the one on the left-hand side, I decided to use 2 thin layers of burnt umber apple barrel paint. For the one in the center, I decided to use 2 thin layers of taupe gray by Anita's Acrylic. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby for that one. And finally, for the one that I did in the gray on the far right-hand side, I put 2 thin coats of pigment paint for that guy to create that darker look on these characters. And the reason why we do this kind of two-tone is kind of give this kind of organic look to it. When you look at wolves in the wild, traditionally speaking, the top and shoulder of their fur is much darker than their underfur, and I think that's to help them kind of blend in and be a little bit more camouflage with their environment. Now, the next thing we'll do, of course, is to do our dry brushing all over the miniatures. So let's go ahead and talk about exactly what we use for this color. So regardless of what color I end up using, I actually used for the undercoat for the wolves, I dry brushed them all in the exact same color, which is pale gray by Folk Art. You can get that at your local Hobby Lobby or Walmart. And the reason why is because I was just feeling kind of lazy. I didn't really want to spend too much time dry brushing these things in different colors. So I did the softer fur and the underbelly with that pale gray. I also did exactly the same thing with the pigment paint that we had for its darker fur on its shoulders. Now for the one in the center, I dry brushed that fur with ivory, and for the one on the far right hand side, I dry brushed that fur with khaki brown, territorial beige by apple barrel paint as well. You can get those colors at your local Walmart. Now the burnt umber actually didn't do anything in this photo. I don't know why I took a photo of it, so I do apologize for that part. So the next detail we're going to work on are on the hair tufts that these characters have for their headdresses, as well as for the claws of the actual wolves themselves. Now to pick out that detail, I use 2 thin layers of apple barrel black. You can get this at your local Walmart. Just put 2 thin layers directly onto those, so that way we can get that nice rich color on those claws for the Snarl Fangs. The next detail we also focus on are on the leather on the Snarl Fangs, as well as the spear shaft of the rider there on the left-hand side as well. But for that color, we picked 2 thin colors of burnt umber by apple barrel paint to kind of create that nice kind of leather look. We also use exactly the same color on the bow being used by the other rider there on the right-hand side. Now for the details that we actually picked out earlier in black, which are the head crests of the helmets of the headdresses by these goblins, as well as their claws, we picked out that we just dry brushed that real quick with some pewter gray by apple barrel paint. And for the harnesses that we actually created for the saddles for the Snarl Fangs, we also did a dry brush real quick of some pale gray by Folk Art. So the next detail we focus on real quick is on the bases that these guys are riding on. I decided to pick that 2 thin layers of burnt sienna by Folk Art. It's a nice, beautiful, muddy, kind of reddish brown color that I like to use for a lot of the Wasteland bases in my studio's Orcs and Goblins bases. And the nice thing about this, of course, is that these bases are quite textured with some like spiders and like bones and all kinds of different kind of detritus that these guys are running on. But that's perfectly fine though. We'll pick out those details later. For now though, just good solid base coat of 2 thin layers of burnt umber on the bases, and then ready to move on to the leather goods on these miniatures. So the next detail we focus on these characters are things like their clothing, for example, as well as the leather goods these characters are wearing as well. The colors we use for these are for khaki, territorial beige. We also use moccasin brown by Anita's Acrylic that you get your local Hobby Lobby. We also use pewter gray as well as pigment paint by apple barrel paint. All the apple barrel paints you can get at your local Walmart. So things that we did, for example, things like painting up the tops that these characters are wearing. We painted those in 2 thin layers of pigment. For the pants, we use a combination of khaki, territorial beige, as well as acrylic paint as well. And we decided to dry brush the tops these characters are wearing with that pewter gray too, and as well as the leather goods, so that we have that nice kind of leather, kind of worn out look on the clothing that they're wearing. And to make it look a little bit more weathered and worn, like it's been out there in the cold prairie for a long time, we also did another dry brush on top of that with some pale gray by Folk Art, just to create that one additional layering of coloring for this to give them a good solid weathered look on their clothing. And oddly enough, we actually have a lot of these miniatures completed with. So next thing we're doing now are some of the finer details on the actual riders themselves. For their shields, I actually used 2 thin layers of Folk Art's copper by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart. It's a nice, rich, dark copper color that I used directly onto the shields, as well as some of the armor paneling on these characters to kind of create that detail. And as for the bases themselves, and as well as the cloak on the rider and the back, I actually picked out 2 thin layers of Tuscan teal, just because that color contrasts nicely with their green flesh, as well as the earth tones in the bases, as well as throughout the miniatures themselves. And speaking of earth tones, the next thing I decided to do, of course, was to dry brush the bases themselves. I used terracotta by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart. It's a nice terracotta clay-looking color. It's like an orangish red color. And I used it dry brushing directly all over the entire of the miniature, so that way you can see exactly all the different details on the bases that we couldn't see before. As you can see, we see some spiders, some skulls, some bones, some pieces of masonry, all kinds of cool little details that we couldn't see earlier. And I also did a quick dry brush real quick of some Tuscan teal by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart as well. I just did that real quick on the teal that happened on the cloak of the main leader of the riders. So the rider is largely done. We're going to start working on the bases real quick. So for some of the masonry that's on these bases, I picked out 2 thin layers of Tuscan Teal by Apple Barrel Paint. I also used some holly branch for some of the weeds, as well as some of the vines are on these bases as well. For the spider, for the rider in the middle, I picked out 2 thin layers of Wild Iris by Apple Barrel Paint. And for the bones and the skeletons on these bases, I picked out 2 thin layers of Light Mocha by Apple Barrel Paint. To help finalize the very last details on the bases for the parts that I did in green, I dry brushed that with lime sherbet, and for the little spider character there in the center of the screen, I dry brushed him with a little bit of cameo pink by Apple Barrel Paint as well. You can get this at your local Walmart as well. One of the last few details to start working on are the rest of the metallic elements on these characters. For example, for all the bits that are done in silver, things like blades, as well as helmets, as well as bits of armor, we picked out 2 thin layers of gunmetal gray by Folk Art. Now for the armor on some of the characters, like on the one there on the left in the center there, we picked that out in 2 thin layers of Deco Arts Emperor's Gold, which you can also get at Walmart. And then lastly, for the last bit of details, so things like the top of the helmet, the shaft of the weapons, things of that nature, we picked out 2 thin layers of Folk Arts Copper. The very last color we also used as well was Anita's True Acrylic in red. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby as well. And the things that we did for this are things like fabrics, so sashes, cloth wrappings, capes, wrappings around the weaponry, for example, around the wolves. We also use this to create little dots for the eye color of the Goblin Riders, as well as the eyes of the wolves. So with most of the miniatures completed, the next thing we're going to do, of course, is an oil wash. Now, when it comes to the oil wash, you do an all-over wash with the same color. Now, traditionally speaking, a lot of people like using Army Painter Strong Tone to do this step, which is perfectly fine because it's a wonderful product that does as advertised. The only problem, though, is that Army Painter Strong Tone does cost $34.99 a can, whereas Minwax Polyshade Acrylic in Mission Oak does exactly the same thing, but only costs $7.99 a can. So I decided to use the Polyshade Acrylics by Minwax, and I put it like a wash all over the entirety of the miniature, and actually does a couple things for us. The first thing it does, of course, is that it seeps directly down to the recesses of the miniatures and brings a lot of those details that we couldn't see earlier. So things like the individual tuft of fur, folds and fabrics, that sort of thing. The next thing it also does too is it also blends in smooths out our transitions between our dry brushing as well as our base coating, removing that pastel look that we saw earlier and make it look more holistic as well as organic with the dry brushing as well as the base coating. And the last thing it does, of course, is it mutes down the vibrancy of the colors that we use and makes it more subdued. That's the reason why we use such bright colors in the first place. Now, after you get done using this oil wash, you will have to let this stuff dry and cure for about 24 hours. So my suggestion to you is to use this as the very last step of your painting process, wait 24 hours, and then get back to it again. Now, this next step, of course, is completely optional, but one of the things you have to worry about is that once this stuff dries, it does have a high gloss sheen on your miniatures. In order to make a matte finish on these miniatures, I just spray with some Krylon matte varnish. You can get this spray at your local Walmart. I just do it once over real fast to kind of mute down the sheen and make it a little bit more subdued. And the very last detail we take care of is the rim of the bases, in which case I rim in 2 thin coats of terracotta by Folk Art, and we are completely done with that very last detail. That terracotta look is the same kind of basing material I use for all the Orcs and Goblins in the studio's collection. So now that we're done talking about exactly how to paint these guys up, let's go on and talk about the shopping list that you'll need to get from both Army Painter as well as Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using the name brand paints instead. Alright, so here's the shopping list you're going to get from both Army Painter as well as from Citadel in order to achieve the exact same results we did, but using the name brand paints instead. You buy a can of Corax White Spray, which costs $17, as well as Thunderhawk Blue, Baneblade Brown, Nagaroth Night, Militarum Green, Longbeard Gray, Fulgrim Pink, Abaddon Black, Teclis Black, Caliban Green, Cyberite Green, Morghast Bone, Baylor Brown, Slanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, Mephiston Red, XV88, Rakarth Flesh, as well as Doombowl Brown. Same thing with Squig Orange as well as Ulthuan Gray, and all those colors cost $4.55 a piece. You also need to buy a can of Wildwood as well as Leadbelcher, Screaming Bell, as well as Aethematic Blue and Retributor Armor, and those pots cost $7.80 as well. You'll need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32, as well as a can of Minotaur Varnish for $19.50. And assuming that you're producing everything on this list for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $190.70 to paint your miniatures the same way we did with using our cheap craft paints. Our cheapskate total came up to $31.67, and when you subtract the two, you end up with a grand total savings of $159.03. So there you guys have it. If you're looking for a way to save some money on the miniatures wargaming hobby, may I suggest switching to cheap craft paints. You can achieve similar results with the name brand paints, but with only a fraction of the price, and given these economic times we're living in, saving every money, every dollar kind of counts for the most part. So there you guys have it. That's how you guys can cheaply paint out Rippa, Snarl, Fangs for your games of Warhammer Underworlds. As always, please feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. You guys' input is invaluable to us as always, and we'll catch you guys on the next video. Peace out and stay classy.